37 meters beneath the surface of the Mediterranean. Hidden along a stretch of jagged French coastline, there's an opening in the rock that almost nobody would ever notice. No warning sign marks it. No current pulls toward it. For thousands of years it simply sat there, swallowed by rising water, holding something no one alive knew existed. It took an ordinary man with an oxygen tank and a habit of chasing curiosity to find it, and what he eventually uncovered would force scientists to rewrite what they thought they understood about Ice Age humans and the animals they lived alongside. In the summer of 1985, a diving instructor named Henri Cosca was exploring the underwater cliffs near Cap Marjou, just outside Marseille, a coastline he had already spent years getting to know. At roughly 37 meters down, he spotted a narrow opening cut into the limestone, the kind of gap most divers would swim straight past without a second look. Cosca didn't. He eased himself into the crack and found that it opened into a tunnel, stretching more than 170 meters into darkness and rising slowly upward as it went. He had no idea at the time that he was staring into the mouth of something that predated the pyramids by tens of thousands of years. He came back to it again and again over the following years, always alone, always pushing a little further than the last time. On one of those solo trips, his light failed while he was deep inside the passage, and he had to feel his way back out through total blackness with no way of knowing how much distance stood between him and open water. He later described the experience as terrifying enough to make him question whether he should keep exploring by himself at all. But the pull of the unknown tunnel was stronger than his fear, and by 1990 he had come to accept that finishing the job alone simply wasn't realistic anymore. That year he brought in 2 Belgian cave divers, brothers who specialized in exactly this kind of extreme, silt-choked underwater work. Moving carefully so they wouldn't stir up the fine sediment coating the tunnel floor, a single wrong kick could turn the water into an opaque soup and leave a diver essentially blind. They extended Cosca's guideline further than he had ever gone. Eventually they reached something remarkable, an underground lake, and above it, a pocket of trapped air. That meant there was dry, unfluted space somewhere beyond the water, a chamber that hadn't seen open-air currents in millennia. Their line ran out before they could confirm it, and they had to turn back without answers. It took almost another year before anyone returned to finish what they'd started. In June of 1991, one of the Belgian divers went back to lay the final stretch of guideline needed to safely reach the dry chamber. The dive itself was brief, but it proved the space was real and reachable. Weeks later, Cosca made the trip that would change everything. He brought his niece and 2 friends along, and together they pushed past the flooded lake and into a chamber untouched by daylight since before the end of the last glacial period. What they found on the walls didn't immediately register as ancient. Cosca's first thought, staring at the shapes and markings surrounding him, was that someone had broken in and spray-painted graffiti on the rock. It seemed far more plausible than the alternative, that he was looking at genuine prehistoric artwork sitting in a chamber nobody could reach without scuba gear. Slowly, as the group examined the images more closely, the truth settled in. This wasn't vandalism. It was something that had been sitting exactly as it was for tens of thousands of years, untouched by wind, sunlight, or human hands, sealed behind a wall of seawater the entire time. That discovery should have been the story's happy ending. Instead, tragedy intervened before anyone outside a small circle even knew the cave existed. Word of Cosca's find had begun spreading quietly through the local diving community, and in September of 1991, 3 divers from Grenoble decided to explore the same passage. On their own, they never made it out. They became disoriented in the narrow tunnel and drowned before they could find their way back to open water. Cosca and one of his companions took part in the grim task of helping recover the bodies, and in the aftermath, keeping the cave a private secret was no longer something anyone could justify. 2 days after the recovery, Cosca formally reported everything to France's maritime authorities in Marseille. Within days, the case had been handed to the country's regional archaeological service under the Ministry of Culture, and what had been one man's 6-year private obsession became a matter of national scientific concern almost overnight. Verifying the paintings, though, wasn't going to be simple. Almost no archaeologist who specialized in Ice Age art also happened to be a trained cave diver capable of reaching a chamber 37 meters underwater through a narrow, silt-filled passage. Authorities eventually turned to Jean Cortin, an archaeologist whose expertise leaned more toward later prehistoric periods, but who had the diving skill the job required. In September of 1991, Cortin led an expedition that included Jean Klotz, one of the world's leading specialists in cave art, out to the site aboard a research vessel. Klotz himself wasn't a diver at the time. He had only seen the cave through photographs, but the images intrigued him enough that he learned to scuba dive at the age of 69 specifically so he could examine the paintings himself, a decision that led to dozens of return visits over the following years despite rough seas and frequently cancelled trips. Cortin's team confirmed in 1991 that the artwork was authentically ancient rather than an elaborate modern hoax staged inside a nearly inaccessible cave. That confirmation raised an obvious question. How does an Ice Age art gallery end up at the bottom of the sea? The answer lies in how dramatically different this coastline looked during the last glacial period. Sea levels back then sat as much as 100 to 120 meters lower than they do now, because enormous volumes of the planet's water were locked away in glacier and ice sheets. The cave that Koska found sat roughly 6 kilometers inland at the time, overlooking open, grassy terrain rather than any ocean. As the planet warmed roughly 10,000 years ago and the glacier began melting rapidly, sea levels rose steadily across the globe. The shoreline crept inland over thousands of years, eventually swallowing the valley outside the cave, then continuing to rise until the entrance itself disappeared underwater around 9,000 years ago. Nobody sealed this cave on purpose. The sea did it gradually, drowning the entrance rather than collapsing it, and in doing so accidentally preserved everything inside. Proving that timeline required more than a plausible geological story, though, and initial estimates of the cave's age faced real skepticism from researchers who thought the numbers sounded implausibly old without direct confirmation. Radiocarbon dating material this ancient is difficult, but not impossible, and scientists built their case using multiple independent lines of evidence. One of the clearest signs came from thin mineral crusts of calcite that had formed directly over several paintings, a process that takes far longer than a few decades, meaning anything sealed beneath that layer had to be genuinely old. In 1998, researchers added wood and pollen fragments recovered from the site that matched the same era. Eventually, Jean Klotz and Jean Cortin gathered 27 separate radiocarbon dates that clustered into two distinct groups, one around 27,000 years ago and another around 19,000 years ago, showing that the cave hadn't been decorated in a single visit by a single group. Later studies expanded on this considerably, running around 60 additional tests on 41 samples between 1992 and 2012, confirming human visits spanning from roughly 33,000 to 19,000 years ago across two major, largely separate phases tied to two different prehistoric cultures, the earlier Gravettian people and the later Solutrean people, the latter known elsewhere in Europe for notable advances in toolmaking. What makes the artwork itself so unusual isn't just its age but its subject matter. Most of France's famous decorated caves, places like Lascaux and Chauvet, are covered in horses, bison, and mammoths, animals of the open plains and forests. This cave breaks from that pattern almost entirely. Alongside horses, ibex, chamois, and an extinct giant deer, the walls are covered in seals and birds that most people who see them immediately assume are penguins. Roughly 500 individual images have been documented across the site, representing 11 different species, including animals long vanished from the Mediterranean entirely. Those flightless, black and white seabirds almost certainly weren't penguins, since penguins have never lived anywhere in the northern hemisphere. Researchers believe the artists were depicting great auks, a large seabird that once thrived across the North Atlantic and looked remarkably similar to a small penguin, complete with the same swimming build. Great auks went extinct in the 1800s, hunted into oblivion, which makes this cave one of the only places on Earth where one is preserved in charcoal and pigment. Some of the markings inside are even thought to depict jellyfish octopuses, an entire underwater ecosystem painted onto stone by people living beside a coastline that has since vanished. Deep inside the cave, past the flooded tunnel, the ceiling opens into a chamber roughly 30 meters high, large enough that early explorers needed real time just to take in the scale of it. One wall holds what researchers now call the Panel of Horses, a dense cluster of 63 individual horse drawings, one of the largest collections of its kind found anywhere in France. Nearby sit engraved crosses whose purpose is still unknown. But the cave's most debated feature isn't an animal at all. It's the hands. Dozens of hand stencils appear on the walls, made by pressing a palm to the stone and blowing pigment around it. A striking number are missing one or more fingers, almost always sparing the thumb. The same pattern shows up at other Gravettian-era sites across Europe, and researchers still argue over why. Some think the fingers were simply folded out of view. Others point to frostbite, since the damage pattern matches how extreme cold actually affects human hands. A smaller group has proposed a deliberate signaling system, or even ritual mutilation, though most specialists consider that unlikely given how much people depended on intact hands for survival. No explanation has won out. Human figures are almost never shown in art from this period at all, yet this cave includes two startling exceptions, one blending the body of a seal with the upper half of a man, another appearing to show a figure struck by a spade. Nobody knows what story either was meant to tell. A significant portion of the cave's original artwork is already gone, dissolved by centuries of seawater before Cosca ever arrived, with only the upper chambers surviving above the old waterline. In 1992, researchers found a second entrance into the cave system and chose to keep its existence secret for over 30 years, fearing that publicizing it would make an already fragile site impossible to protect. Access today remains restricted to a small number of scientists working under strict supervision, while the public can experience a full-scale replica, Cosca Mediterranean, which opened in Marseille in 2022, built using detailed digital scans of the real cave's surviving sections. Even now, some of the biggest questions remain unanswered. Why marine life dominates these walls when almost no other Ice Age cave in Europe shows the same focus? Why some hands appear deliberately incomplete? And whether two groups of people separated by 8,000 years ever knew what the other had left behind in the dark. What began as one diver following a strange gap in an underwater cliff turned into one of the strangest and most singular windows into the Ice Age ever found, a gallery of seals, extinct seabirds, and vanished species that the rising sea should have destroyed completely, but instead sealed away long enough for someone, eventually, to find.